Hi, I'm Dr Sarah Cassell and I've brought you today to St Peter Hungate, a remarkable medieval church in the centre of Norwich. The church was made redundant in 1936 and it was the first to be repurposed in the country as a museum of church art. This closed in 1995. The church was taken over by the Norwich Historic Churches Trust in 2006, and in 2009 it became Hungate Medieval Art, basically an exhibition space to promote the heritage of Norwich and its art. We'll need to remember this when we go inside, as obviously a lot of the original furnishings have been removed. The church is located in the centre of the city of Norwich. It's set between the Cathedral Quarter and the Dominican Friary, and there are a number of other churches within a very small distance of this church, including St Michael at Plea, St Simon and Jude and St George Tombland. In fact, there were a remarkable number of late medieval churches in Norwich. There were almost 60, of which 31 survive today. Another interesting thing about the location is that it was close to some of the cathedral's interests, and this is something we might bear in mind a bit later on. Here we are in the churchyard to the north of the church. It's about 1/5 of an acre currently. The churchyard may have been larger if we include an adjacent 15th century building, now known as the Britain's Arms. The 18th century antiquarian Francis Bloomfield argued that this may have housed a community of religious women, possibly the Sisters of St Peter or the Sisters of Hungate. Just across the road from this building is the original Dominican Friary, which encroached on the parish of St Peter Hungate. The earliest surviving references to St Peter Hungate date from the mid-13th century, but the existing building largely dates from the 15th century, when there were a lot of wealthy parishioners and many church rebuilding projects around the city. Exactly when this work took place is a matter of debate, and we'll have to analyse a variety of evidence from records and from the building itself. The 15th century church was attached to an existing tower, as we can see from a scar on the east side of the tower, which shows that the nave was originally narrower with a higher roof. Several publications repeat the claim that Thomas Ingham, a wealthy mercer and mayor of Norwich, built the tower and donated towards the chancel in 1431, although this cannot be corroborated. The height of the tower was reduced for safety reasons in 1888-9, removing the parapet and also the belfry openings. Even without this, the tower is quite modest in size. Although aspects of the tower are difficult to date, it may date from the 14th century, it was certainly standing when the nave and transepts were added in the 15th century. Regarding the porch, it was described as new in the will of Nicholas Ingham, who asked to be buried there. His will was proved in 1499. However, Dr Helen Lunnan has pointed out that it would have looked rather old-fashioned then, because the entrance arch mouldings are more suggestive of the late 14th century. So there's a little bit of a mystery there. The porch has a ground plan which Dr Lunnan has shown is smaller than average in East Anglia. It's one of only 30% of porches which are two-storied in the region. and the upper storey would have been accessed through a narrow staircase just inside, and it was probably designed for practical purposes. Francis Bloomfield described how the right to appoint the priest or rector and to collect tithes and other income at Hungate was in the hands of the College of St Mary in the Fields from 1271 until 1458, when it passed to John and Margaret Paston and their heirs forever. He claimed that this was no sooner done, but they and the rector demolished the whole old fabric, which was in decay, and rebuilt the present church, which is in the form of a cross and is a neat building of black flint. A much eroded inscription outside the church, on a buttress by the north door, was understood as meaning that the building was completed, or fundata, in 1460, a mere 2 years later. This is a nice, neat story, but it's impossible that the church could have been reconstructed in such a short space of time, and this interpretation has been discredited. Work must have started earlier. We know that Thomas Ingham's son, also Thomas, left 20 shillings for the reparation of the church in 1451, as his will survives. And in the same year, John Daplin, a mason, bequeathed 4 marks for making a bell painting the rood loft. This sort of work would normally take place when the actual construction of a building was complete. We know that the Pastons were in Norwich from 1440 onwards, at least periodically, and that they associated with other members of the mercantile elite, engaged in church rebuilding across the city, including at the neighbouring Blackfriars. Rather than 2 years, their investment and engagement in the reconstruction at Hungate must have spanned nearer 2 decades. John and Margaret Paston are synonymous with St Peter Hungate, and their investment in its fabric seems undisputed. However, it was not their private funerary chapel, as sometimes asserted. Unlike their son, Walter Paston, they were not actually buried at Hungate. The benefaction of the Pastons spread far more widely than this church, and it's entirely possible that the building was a more collaborative enterprise than has generally been imagined. Francis Bloomfield described the church as a neat building of black flint, and this is still recognisable today, despite subsequent changes and renovations. There are no large deposits of stone other than flint in East Anglia, so any alternative finely worked or dressed ashlar stone found in East Anglian churches had to be imported at expense. At Hungate, a lot of the exterior flint work is squared, a time-consuming and also expensive process, which speaks to the wealth and status of its patrons. The quality and coherence of the building work at Hungate is exceptional in the nave and transepts. The huge scale of the windows in relation to the mother's building is evident from the exterior. There's a lot of evidence of repair work to the chancel at the east end of the church. The east wall, made of brick, rubble and flint, shows evidence of quite early repair work, and it was actually plastered over until the early 20th century. Again, there were early 20th century repairs to the north wall. In 1753 a vestry had been added, and there was an entrance into the chancel inside, which was removed in the early 20th century. While we're outside, it's worth noticing the rood stair, which is attached to the east side of the chancel here. We'll come back to that when we're inside. We're entering St Peter Hungate through the late 15th century south porch. Dr Helen Lunnan has shown that porches like this developed a variety of functions. They started to be built and proliferate from the early 13th century, and this coincided with a couple of important factors. One of them was the spread of the sacramental decrees of Pope Innocent III's Fourth Lateran Council of 1215. The other was the general interdict against England and Wales laid down by the Pope because King John refused his candidate for the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton. The interdict meant that the sacraments were forbidden, so nobody could attend Mass, receive extreme unction, or bury their deceased relatives in consecrated ground with religious ceremony. Only the baptism of infants and the confession of the dying were permitted for over 6 years, until 1214. A consecrated forebuilding to the church, without a door or window glazing, may have been understood as an advantage in this context, providing an easily accessible space for condensed versions of the sacraments, such as confession and confirmation. Seating was clearly provided in the porch, and it's worth taking a moment to look at what must have been the holy water stoop. Okay, let's go through the keyhole. The narrow, winding stair up to the upper chamber of the porch suggests that the use of the room upstairs was purely practical, certainly not ceremonial in any sense. By the late 13th century, the laity had responsibility for the nave of a parish church, that is the section westwards from the chancel arch or the screen. And at St Peter Hungate this was no exception, and it included the provision of a font, usually at the west end, as it is here in front of the West Tower, for the provision of the sacrament of baptism. It's kind of symbolically located near the entrance to the church. At Hungate, the 15th century font has a design of quatrefoils around the bowl and then tracery against the stem. It's a little bit more restrained than some designs that we find elsewhere. It was possibly coloured originally, like a lot of other features in the church, and it would have probably had a more elaborate cover than this 17th century replacement. Other font designs in East Anglia include figurative imagery. Some of them feature 4 lions or standing figures against the stem, with the symbols of the 4 evangelists and lions or demi-angels bearing shields against the bowl. Some more elaborate examples feature carvings of the 7 sacraments around the octagonal bowl, representing baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist, confession, marriage, the anointing of the sick, and ordination. There are some 25 of those in Norfolk and 13 in Suffolk. A lot of those have suffered iconoclasm since, but this font at Hungate is relatively intact apart from any pigment. The overall impression of the nave and transepts at Hungate is of elegance, uniformity and coherence, primarily due to the unified roof design and the window tracery. The windows are a defining feature, accounting for about 60% of the nave walling and flooding the building with light. The windows were designed to display stained glass, and in order to maximise the impact of that, they are framed by wall arches, and the wall has been minimised to make sure that the glazing is visible. At this point, perhaps it's worth stopping for a minute to remind ourselves of the repurposing of St Peter Hungate and the fact that the building has been stripped of quite a few of its original furnishings and actually includes, for example, these pews which had come from another church. They were originally at St Andrew Tottington, a Breckland church, in an area which is now a military training zone, which was evacuated in 1944. They've got particularly fine bench ends with poppy heads, animals, mostly dogs but not entirely, and also tracery beneath. In the Middle Ages, people generally stood or knelt for the Mass, but by the 15th century, pews proliferated. Sometimes they were a status symbol, they could also express social satire or piety. These pews would not have been arranged in a church like this. They would have been in rows either side of a central aisle. Where people were seated in pews, they would have been divided up according to status and gender. I'm standing in front of the north transept of St Peter Hungate. Hungate is an unusual design for an East Anglian parish church. The ground plan forms a cross. The nave doesn't have any side aisles, and instead there are transepts to the north and the south. If we just move over, in 1851, during restoration work, the blocked roof stair was discovered, and also a statue niche. And then if we move over to the south transept, another niche was discovered, and it may well have held a statue of St John the Baptist. The chapel was dedicated to the saint. Walter Paston, the son of John and Margaret, died quite young, and he was buried in front of it. Each side of the nave there are squints, so that people could look through and see the activity in the transept chapel. The braced hammer beam roof spans the nave and transepts, the braces set diagonally at the crossings. The vaulted appearance of the design would have evoked heavenly associations. The innovatory design, sophisticated carving and complex narrative of the unified roofs of the nave and transepts at St Peter Hungate are exceptional, not only within the medieval churches of Norwich, but across East Anglia. The single hammer beam roof at Hungate is extremely unusual, not only in its structure, but in the form and evenly high quality of the angelic carvings, and in the coherence of its multimedia iconography. Links with James Woodroffe, who worked at the cathedral and probably designed the Oakham Gate, may account for the unusual structure of the Hungate roof, the form and evenly high quality of the wooden beam and stone corbel carvings, and the coherence of their iconography. In many roofs, although including a motif in the overall scheme was sometimes more important than its precise location, at least some representations seem to have been deliberately positioned in relation to particular sites of engagement or furnishings, especially at the spatial division between the nave and chancel in a church. And this seems to be true at Hungate, where, as Sandy Heslop has said, the nave is constituted as concerned with the authority of the church on earth, and the crossing area as the realm of heaven. In the roof at Hungate, most of the angels are dressed as acolytes or subdeacons in the nave, with predominantly feathered angels around the crossing and the transepts. Angelic pairings face each other north and south in the nave, signalling three significant junctions. The high quality of the carving and the imagery of the stone corbels underneath the wall posts of the roof at St Peter Hungate are exceptional. They seem to indicate high status work, a deliberate intent, a deliberate scheme, and high quality work. In the nave, there are 4 remarkable books depicting the 4 doctors of the church: St. Augustine, St. Ambrose, St. Gregory and St. Jerome, possibly in a unique ensemble in roof corbel imagery. In my previous research, I found that donor images on chancel screens associated with the 4 Latin doctors seem to be an apparent show of orthodoxy or learning. It may have been a signal of an opposition to heresy. It's possible that the imagery of the 4 doctors of the church had an additional significance in the wake of the Norwich heresy trials of 1428 to 31, to make a point of underlining the orthodox belief of its donors, even although heresy wasn't prevalent in the city, in contrast to some rural areas and other cities. The rebuild of the nave and transepts at St. Peter Hungate resulted in a centralised 3-dimensional rood canopy. The blocked rood stair implies the lost imagery of Christ on the cross, the Virgin, and John the Evangelist. Where the diagonal braces of the roof intersect, angelic carvings surround an exceptional wooden boss depicting Christ in judgment. At the corners of the crossing below, unusual stone corbels represent the 4 evangelists, God's earthly messengers, in a hierarchical intercessory arrangement with angelic heavenly messengers on the beams above them, possibly all representing archangels. The evangelist bosses are of the same high standard of carving as those of the 4 doctors in the nave, again indicating high status work. The ensemble at the crossing represents the culmination of a complex iconographic scheme, permeated with references to the Last Judgment, in an arrangement highly unusual in late medieval roofs with angelic and other representations. For example, the depiction of St. Michael at the crossing is unique, and the armoured attire of the archangel associated with the weighing of the souls at the Last Judgment seems very specifically linked to the unusual form and revelation iconography of this roof. The ensemble at the crossing represents the culmination of a complex scheme which shows how images in different materials could be assembled in the late medieval church, both in site-specific dialogue with each other and as components of a coherent whole. The relationship between the roof and the rood marked the climax of a sustained multimedia programme in stone, wood and paint. Also, it's impossible not to remark upon the modern gilding of the Hungate angels. The 1968 guidebook referred to this as recently done. Unfortunately, it does obscure some of the really fine detail on the angels, and it's not how they were intended to appear, and there's no trace of pigment on the rest of the roof. There seems to have been a widespread perception in the late medieval period that angels were actively engaged in the Mass, bearing the sacrifice of the altar on earth up to the altar in heaven. And people may well have felt that the angels were with them as they prayed to join them in the eternal chant of the Sanctus. The remarkable roof over the nave and transepts at St. Peter Hungate is a particularly exceptional example of a trend for angel roofs, particularly in East Anglia, although not exclusively. A trend which began at the beginning of the 15th century in the wake of Richard II's remarkable roof at Westminster Hall. At this point, we really need to use a bit of imagination. We've already seen outside the evidence of the rood stair, and on the wall of the north transept we have the evidence of the blocked-in stair from the other side. But when we come across and look at the division between the nave and transepts with the chancel, it's completely open today. Basically, there would have been a rood screen on which there may well have been imagery or other designs painted, and above there would have been a rood loft from which the rood may have hung, with an image of Christ, an image of Mary, an image of St John the Evangelist. All of this imagery was swept away, possibly at the Reformation, maybe afterwards. Although the screen would have divided the nave from the chancel, it wasn't really seen like a barrier by people in the 15th century. There was a change in patronage for screens. In the 14th century, early screens tended to reflect the social status as well as the piety of perhaps an individual landowner. But in the 15th century, we have plenty of will evidence that shows that members of the laity were contributing to these screens, and any imagery or painting on them faced towards the nave, so it addressed them, not the chancel. The chancel is quite a contrast with the nave and transepts. It doesn't seem to have been as strongly built. There was a major repair campaign at the beginning of the 17th century, and again repairs had to be undertaken in the early 20th century. You'll note that the roof is not original. In terms of the rest of the design, it doesn't seem to have the same level of coherence as the nave and transepts. So, for example, there are 4 different window tracery designs, and it lacks the window arches that we saw in the nave and transepts, which really define the windows. Over the centuries, whether deliberately or by accident, a lot of Hungate's medieval glass was lost, and what remained was rearranged. The stained and painted glass that survives dates from around 1450 and 1525, when another generation of the Pastons refurbished the chancel. From the figures that remain, as well as the small fragments, it's been possible for scholars to reconstruct at least parts of a carefully planned scheme of glazing. We know from an early source that the east window once contained heraldic glass, indicating the patronage of the Paston family, but now it contains figures of apostles, evangelists and female saints, and half-length figures of angels, all somewhat fragmentary and patched. Among them is a donor panel of a priest kneeling praying in front of a tomb, which may once have borne the date 1522, suggesting that it might be the portrayal of the rector at the time of the refurbishment, although his identity is uncertain. The 4 other chancel windows were probably filled with figures of the evangelists and doctors of the church, some of which are now in the east window. And again, this imagery repeats imagery from the nave and transepts, with an emphasis upon orthodox subject matter. From the scantest fragments, it can be guessed that the transept windows were filled with scenes from the life of the Virgin Mary, and the nave windows were probably filled with martyrs, saints and other biblical figures. It seems likely that most of the angels were all in the upper parts of the transept windows, originally forming a choir with the roof angels. There's another glimpse of what would have been extremely rich, colourful imagery in the church when we look at the top lights of the west window in the tower. The angels that are featured there would originally have come from the tops of one of the nave windows. So the 15th century rebuilding project at St Peter Hungate reflects the ambition, wealth and piety of its parishioners. I hope you've enjoyed this short tour, which will be followed by some links for further research. Thank you.